My parents insisted I study law. It's a family tradition, they said. But when I graduated, they forced me to defend them in a legal battle, because I was the only one who could keep their secrets. I was 6 years old when my mother first said, "Law is in our blood." She was in the middle of adjusting the collar on my father's robe, her fingers nimble as she straightened the heavy fabric with an air of reverence. My father stood still, staring straight ahead, that steely, practiced look on his face that I came to know so well over the years. He looked like he was born to wear that robe, and to wield the authority that came with it. I'd seen him in it hundreds of times, and yet every time felt just as ominous as the last. "What do you mean?" I had asked, pulling at the hem of my shirt, peering up at her with the mix of curiosity and apprehension that children are so good at. Mom smiled, but her lips barely moved. It was the kind of smile she saved for public appearances, for cocktail hours and client dinners. "It means that you, me, your father, your grandfather. We all have it in us. To protect, to defend, to fight when no one else will." She smoothed my hair, the pressure of her palm heavier than a caress, almost like a warning. "One day, Valentine, you'll understand." I was 12 by the time I'd started to get hints of what she meant. I'd sit in our formal dining room, watching as my parents hosted their famous Sunday brunches. They would gather around the table with judges, attorneys, corporate executives, even a few political figures, each guest strategically placed to foster alliances. I was usually relegated to a seat at the edge of the table, as if I were an ornament, a silent witness to their calculated laughter and stiff politeness. They'd chuckle and swap stories about cases that they all seemed to find amusing in a way I couldn't grasp, glancing at me now and then with subtle glances that said, "One day, this will be yours too." My father would lean back in his chair, a glass of brandy in hand, and say, "The only true friends you make in law are the friends you keep in your pocket." But it wasn't until I was 15 that my father sat me down to deliver what he believed was a life-defining speech. We were at the dining table, just the two of us, a mountain of his legal briefs and files stacked between us, separating him from me. He didn't offer to clear them away, and I didn't dare move them. He looked at me with that piercing expression, the kind that made even judges and seasoned lawyers sweat. "Valentine," he began, his voice low, controlled. He always used my full name, never Val, as if he were reminding me that I was destined for something grander, something larger. "Law runs in your veins. Your grandfather, me, your uncles. We've all dedicated our lives to this field. It's a legacy, a duty. You have to start taking it seriously." I remember feeling the weight of it then, a physical heaviness that settled in my gut.
"But what if I started, unsure how to say what I was feeling.
"What if I don't want to do this? What if I don't want to be like you?" He cut me off with a wave of his hand, as if he already knew every word I'd planned to say. "There's no what if, Valentine. This is your path, and you'll walk it. You don't get to squander this legacy. Guruxes are built for this." He leaned forward, and I could smell the faint remnants of his cologne, a rich, peppery scent that seemed to radiate authority. "We don't get to choose our destiny, we inherit it." I didn't argue. In our family, to argue with my father was to invite chaos. I nodded, and that was that. By the time I graduated from high school, I'd accepted that my path was set in stone. I went to an Ivy League college, and then, as expected, straight into law school. I passed the bar with flying colors, and not long after, I was recruited into my father's firm, exactly as he'd planned. The only missing part was the passion everyone seemed to think I'd have for it. In the beginning, I convinced myself that maybe I could find a way to make it work. I thought that if I threw myself into the cases, maybe I'd learn to love them. But that was easier said than done, especially when you're assigned the work no one else wants, the tasks they label as character building. My character building years were nothing more than an endless series of nights poring over tedious, morally dubious cases. As I got more entrenched in the work, I started to see the kind of clients my father took on. Developers with questionable ethics, politicians who had dirtied their hands in all the wrong places, corporate bigwigs who'd broken more laws than they could count. My father would spin his wins as if he were defending saints, always framing his victories as triumphs of justice. But I knew better. He'd proudly say, "If a case has a stench to it, odds are that a juror is the one handling it." And I'd stand there, nodding along as if I were proud too. One day, I dared to bring it up. "Dad," I said carefully, "don't you ever? I don't know. Wonder if maybe some of these people. They might be." He looked up from his paperwork, raising an eyebrow. "What are you getting at, Valentine?" I swallowed, feeling my heart thudding in my chest. "It just feels unethical. Some of these clients. We know what they're doing." My father's eyes hardened. "Unethical?" he repeated, his voice thick with disdain. "Let me remind you, Valentine, that our job is to defend. We don't make judgments. We protect, no matter who the client is." He leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. "And I expect you, of all people, to understand that. This isn't about feelings. It's about legacy." I didn't say anything. I couldn't. Because in that moment, I realized that for my father, law was not about justice. It was about control. It was about power. Despite my misgivings, I stayed. Partly out of loyalty, partly out of fear. My family had invested everything in me. I couldn't just walk away. And maybe, in some dark part of myself, I didn't want to. Then came the case that would change everything. It started innocently enough, or as innocently as anything in our firm ever started. A big developer in the area, a man named Frederick Holden, was planning to build a massive shopping complex in a residential district, pushing out dozens of families who had lived there for generations. It wasn't unusual work for us. Holden was one of my father's oldest clients, and he'd managed to bypass dozens of ordinances over the years thanks to our family's connections. But this time, something was different. The feds were sniffing around, claiming there was evidence of corruption, bribery, and even some unaccounted money in overseas accounts linked to Holden's name. My father dismissed it as a nuisance investigation, but the authorities were closing in. Soon, our firm itself was under scrutiny. My parents, in a surprising display of humility, didn't tell the extended family about the investigation. They didn't want to stain the Giroux name, as they put it. And besides, they had a plan. One night, I was called into the living room. My mother and father sat side by side, both with expressions as fixed as statues. They looked almost regal, like royalty about to deliver a decree. "We want you to represent us," my mother began, her voice smooth and unwavering. "With this case. It's sensitive, Valentine. You understand the family, the business. We need someone we can trust. Someone who understands the nuances." My heart sank. "Me?" I asked, barely able to keep the shock from my voice. My father nodded, his gaze piercing. "Yes, you. It's time to prove your loyalty, Valentine. You know everything there is to know about this family. You're one of us. You're the only one we can trust with the family's secrets." I stared at them, my heart pounding. "Secrets?" I repeated. "What kind of secrets?" My father's gaze flickered ever so slightly, but he recovered quickly. "Nothing you don't already know," he replied smoothly. "Just sensitive matters. Things you don't want in the wrong hands." I looked between them, my mind racing. "And what happens if I don't?" My mother's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with disbelief. "Valentine, what are you saying? You'd abandon us? In our time of need?" My father didn't even blink. "Then you'll be turning your back on your own family, on everything we've built." His voice was cold, unyielding. "And you know we'd never forgive that." Their words echoed in my head long after I left the room. In that moment, I realized they were right. I was their pawn, the loyal Giroux they could count on to keep their secrets. I didn't sleep that night. My mind raced, piecing together memories I'd brushed aside, things I'd overheard, secrets they never thought I would remember. By morning, my loyalty was already cracking. I knew what they'd done, even if I didn't have the whole picture. And they thought I'd just go along with it. The trial preparation started the next week, and I worked side by side with them, acting like the loyal Giroux they expected me to be. My father fed me carefully selected pieces of information, barely letting me touch anything important, while my mother watched with her usual cold intensity, as if daring me to step out of line. But I was patient. I played my part, waiting for the right moment. Then one night, while everyone else was gone, I found it. It was an old ledger buried deep in the files in my father's office. Most of it was written in code, but I could make out enough to know it was a record of payments, off-the-books money, funneled through shell companies and offshore accounts. They had been paying off officials for years, bribing people to look the other way, laundering money through friends, sometimes even family. It was all right there, and it was worse than I'd thought. I knew this was the final piece I needed, the leverage to bring them down. But I couldn't just walk in and hand it over. I had to be smart. I had to make sure they didn't see it coming. For the next few weeks, I pretended nothing had changed. I continued to work with my parents, nodding along, acting like I was all in on the case. But behind the scenes, I was busy. I made copies of the ledger and hid them in places they'd never think to look. I reached out to a few contacts, people I knew would be interested in a scandal of this magnitude. People who hated my parents, who'd been waiting for the chance to take them down. Finally, the trial date came. My father was confident, grinning like he'd already won, while my mother watched me with that same proud but icy look. They were so convinced I was on their side. They had no idea I'd already set everything in motion. The morning of the trial, I showed up with a folder in hand, the same folder I'd been carrying for weeks, filled with the documents I'd prepared for their defense. But this time, the contents were different. I had every document they needed to defend themselves, everything that could protect them from going to prison. But I wasn't giving it to them. When we entered the courtroom, I slipped away, leaving them at the defense table. I walked over to the prosecutor's team, folder in hand, and quietly handed it over. "You'll want to look at this," I said, keeping my voice low. "It's all there. Everything you need to take them down." The prosecutor's eyes widened as he flipped through the pages, quickly realizing what he was holding. "Are you sure about this?" he whispered, clearly stunned. I nodded, a strange calm settling over me. More sure than I've ever been. The trial began, and I took my seat near the back, watching as my parents scanned the room, looking for me. They finally spotted me, confusion flashing across their faces as they realized I wasn't sitting with them. My mother's eyes narrowed, her jaw clenched, and my father's face twisted with disbelief. Then the prosecutor stood up. One by one, he laid out the evidence, the bribes, the offshore accounts, the shell companies. He called witnesses, people I'd quietly gathered over the past few weeks who could testify against my parents. My father's expression shifted from confidence to horror as he realized that every one of his carefully guarded secrets was now public knowledge. By the time the prosecutor finished, my parents were pale, trembling. My mother glanced back at me, her eyes wide with betrayal, as if she couldn't believe what I'd done. When the judge asked if they had anything to say, my father stammered, trying to come up with an excuse, a defense, anything to explain away the mountain of evidence against him. But he couldn't. There was nothing left to say. As the judge handed down their sentence, I felt a strange sense of relief. They were going to prison, and there was nothing they could do about it. All the years of manipulation, the lies, the control, they'd finally caught up with them. And for the first time in my life, I was free. As I walked out of the courtroom, I didn't look back.